hoses, lines, wires, all that for any wires that are against the metal that are frayed or anything. Checking all that out as I go. This is where I put my oil in. Get up here, I check my coolant level here. Of course, you wouldn't open it up with it hot. If you had a sight glass, you'd check it with your sight glass. This is my water pump here. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted. It's not leaking. It is gear driven. Check the hoses going to it. Make sure none of those are leaking or cut. Go to my alternator belt here. No more than 3/4 inch deflection. Make sure it's not frayed, cut, any thing showing any kind of damage there. This is my alternator. It is belt driven. Making sure it's properly mounted. Bolt ends not loose. Okay. You can check your fan belts. That's not on your sheet itself, but you can check those fan belts. Make sure it's no more than 3/4 inch deflection. Make sure they're in good shape, not cut, frayed, anything like that.
Are there any alternators that's gear driven?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
But on that sheet, you know what I'm saying. So.
Okay.
You're right. That's what I said. I don't understand why they got that on there. All right, now we'll come over to this side. All right. I'm going to start here with my air compressor. We'll make sure it's properly mounted. It is a gear driven. Check my air lines coming off it. Make sure they're not frayed, cut. Make sure there's not no air leaking. Also, you always want to check though. Make sure your air lines are not rubbing any metal. Okay, if it's rubbing any metal, it could cause a leak. Here's my power steering pump. Here, it is gear driven. Make sure it's properly mounted. None of the bolts are missing. I'm gonna check my lines coming off of it. Check and make sure they're not cut or frayed or not leaking. Checking all of them. Going to my power steering reservoir. You check the fluid here, dipstick, make sure it's full. And I'm going to come down to my power steering. This is my gearbox here. We'll make sure it's properly mounted. It's not any cracks or anything in it, and make sure it's not leaking oil. Come here to my pitman arm and my drag length here. I'm checking them to make sure all my nuts are there, all my castle nuts are there, my Carter keys in. Make sure it's not bent or broke. Coming all around, checking them. Then I check my tie rod going across. Check it, checking, of course, check for the nuts. They're there. Make sure the tie rod's not bent or broke. Steering shaft here. We'll make sure it's properly mounted. Make sure it's not bent or broke. Checking, make sure it's greased here and that universal joint's in good shape there. All the bolts are in it. Always gonna be checking my frame as I come down, checking for any illegal welds or any cracks in the frame. Make sure it's not bent. Coming here to my spring hangers here, front and my back. I'm gonna make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked, broke, anything like that. Checking both of them. Come right here to my spring. Make sure none of the leaves, this leaf spring, make sure none of the leaves are missing, that they're not cracked or broke. Out of line there, checking my U-bolts. Make sure the nuts are on them, make sure they're not loose. Make sure they're not cracked or broke there, okay? Coming here to my shock absorber. Gonna make sure it's both the bolts are in, that it's properly mounted to the frame here and down here. Check and see if they're rubber shims or whatever in there. It's all tight. Make sure it's not leaking or it's bent or broke. Okay. Okay. I'm going to come right here to my air lines going to my brake chamber. Make sure they're not frayed, cut, broke, leaking. Make sure they're tight. Each connection there going to my brake chamber. Going to make sure the clamp going around is tight. Make sure it's not bent or busted, and make sure it's not leaking. Make sure it's properly mounted. Come here to my slack adjuster. Make sure it's properly mounted. Make sure the pins and the Carter keys are in the push rod going to the slack adjuster. Make sure there's no more than an inch play in the slack adjuster there. Okay, in the push when you pull the push rod out. All right, now coming from there, I'm gonna go to my brake drum. Make sure it's not excessively worn. Look for any cracks in it, any excessive wear. Going to my brake pads. Make sure they're not excessively worn. Make sure they're not busted, and make sure they're in good shape. In here too, always when you check in here, check for any oil coming out of there. Okay. Most time, if it's leaking oil, it's going to be on this back side because that's where your seal's at. So always check that too. All right, now I'm going to check my rim here, the wheel. Okay, check it on both sides. I'm looking for any illegal welds, any cracks in it. Looking for rust trails, which would mean loose lug nuts. Coming here to my tire, check the sides of my tire. Make sure no bulges, no cuts. No excessive wear. Looking for any wire showing, and I'm looking to make sure this wearing evenly across. And make sure it's no less than 4/32 here for my depth. Okay. I'm gonna check my tire air pressure right here with a pressure gauge, and I check this one and all my tires down with a pressure gauge. Okay. Coming right here, checking, make sure all my lug nuts are there. Looking for any shiny threads that would mean that the lug nuts are loose. Checking all those out, make sure they're tight. And then I check my hub seal right here and make sure it's not leaking any oil. Okay. Alright, now as I come down through here, I'm going to be checking the lights here. Make sure they're not cracked or busted. And make sure the lenses are there and they're not dirty. All these down the side right here, all the way down. Check my steps here. I'm going to make sure that they're properly mounted, not anything on them to make a slip or fall. Come here to my door. Make sure there's no excessive slack in it. Make sure it opens and closes properly. Okay. Check my mirror mounts here. Make sure they're tight, not loose. Checking my mirrors. Make sure they're not busted, cracked. Make sure they're clean when you see. All right. Checking my exhaust system. Make sure it's properly mounted. Looking for any leaks here. Looking for soot that would mean leak. Checking it out. Coming on down. Checking my fuel tank out. Make sure it's not bent or busted. No fuel leaks. Checking my tank straps. Make sure they're properly mounted. They're tight. They're not loose. Make sure they're not broke. I would check in here for my fire extinguisher, my triangles, and my fuses are, yeah. Circuit breaker, there we go. Alright, I'm going to check my fuel cap here. Check here and make sure the seal on it.
We need to take it off.
It's not leaking there. Did somebody ask a question?
Yeah, we need to take it off.
You don't necessarily have to, just tell me what you're looking for. When I get back here to the back, I'm going to check these lights on the back of the cab here, make sure they're not cracked or not dirty. Here we're going to check the air lines coming off the truck. Make sure they're tight, they're not loose, make sure they're not leaking air there. I'm looking for it. Make sure my air lines are not dry rotted. Checking my electrical line, make sure it's properly hooked up. Checking it for any wires showing that might cause a short. I'm going to come here to the trailer. I'm going to make sure it's properly hooked there, that it's not loose. Checking my glad hands here when they hook to the trailer. Make sure there's no leaks there. Check your glad hand seals and make sure they're not excessively worn or dry rotted. Checked all that out. I'm going to come to my drive shaft in here. Make sure my drive shaft's not broke, cracked, or bent. Taking my universal joints there if I can see it. Make sure all the bolts are in here. Once again, checking my frame as I come down. No cracks or breaks in it. Okay. My torque on is actually in here. That's what, make sure the bolts are in it. It's properly mounted, secure. Okay. Checking my catwalk, make sure my lines are not dragging on the catwalk, checking for any oil on it, and I'm also make sure it's securely mounted, okay? Steps the same way. Make sure they're securely mounted, all the bolts are in them. Alright. Since I'm standing here, I'm going to check the bulkhead, the front of the trailer here, make sure all the rivets are there. There's no cuts in the side of the trailer or anything damaged there. Now I'm gonna go right in here and I'm gonna check my front axle, okay? This is the one I'm gonna check. I'm gonna check my air lines, go into it, make sure they're not cut or frayed, make sure it's not leaking. Check my brake chamber, make sure the clamp is around and secure. It's not loose, make sure the brake chamber is not bent. Or make sure it's not leaking. Go to my slack adjuster, make sure it's properly mounted. Make sure the push rod, the pins are in, going to the push rod, and the Carter keys in so the pins won't come out. No more than an inch play. Okay. Coming right here to my U-bolts, making sure they're tight, they're not loose, make sure they're not broke. Coming to my leaf spring, make sure no leaves are missing, make sure it's not cracked or broke, bent. Coming right in here to my brake drums. Make sure they're not excessively worn, make sure they're not cracked, make sure nobody welded on them or anything. Checking my brake pads, make sure they're not excessively worn, make sure they're not busted or out of there. Alright, coming to my wheels, checking the inside of my rims there, and on both of these tires, make sure there's no illegal welds there, make sure it's not any cracks in the rims, both of the rims here. Checking right here between the spacing right between my bud wheels, make sure there's nothing caught in between there. Alright, going to my tires, checking both of these tires, making sure there's no bulges or cuts, no wire showing, no excessive wear, at least 2 30-seconds tread depth. Once I check that out, then check the condition depth, okay, and then of course inflation, as I said, I would check with there again. I'm gonna come check my lug nuts, make sure they're all there, make sure none of them's missing, make sure that no shiny threads that would mean that it's loose. This is an axle seal here. I would check it and make sure it's not leaking, okay? We'll come right here. There's a shock absorber right here. We'll make sure it's not bent, busted, make sure it's securely mounted. Checking my air bellow here, or airbag, whichever you want to call it. Make sure there's not no cuts in it. Checking for dry rot or any air leaks in it. Alright, spring hanger. I'm going to check my spring hanger here. Make sure it's securely mounted. It's not cracked or broke. Securely mounted to the frame there. Alright, now I'm going to check right here my mounting bolts on my platform here. Checking the mounting bolts, make sure they're all in there. They're tight. None of them are any shiny threads showing that it might be loose. Checking my platform, making sure it's securely mounted up there. Make sure it's no breaks in it. Checking my locking pins on my sliding fifth wheel here. Make sure they're in the proper place, that they're not broke. Any shiny metal showing that something might be moving. I'll check the apron on my trailer here. Make sure it's not cracked or excessively worn here. I'm going to check my actual sliding plate, skid plate on my fifth wheel here. Make sure nothing's cracked or broke on it. Make sure my pins are in the fifth wheel right and they're not broke. Alright. I'm going to come on around here and then I'm going to check my mud flap right here. Make sure it's secure enough. Make sure it's not loose. And it does have the actual mud flap on it. Checking my reflector tape as I come down and my reflectors on my truck. Going up under here, I'm checking my kingpin and my locking jaws, making sure they're locked around the kingpin there. Looking for any space between my apron and my actual fifth wheel. Make sure that the kingpin's not warped or anything's warped there. Check my locking jaws. Alright, on the back of my truck, I'm checking these reflectors, checking these lights. Make sure they're not busted, they're clean there, okay? Checking the ribs up under my trailer, the frame. Looking as I go to make sure none of them are cracked or broke. Okay. Checking my landing gear out as I come back out, make sure it's securely mounted, all the bolts are in it. Make sure it's securely mounted to the trailer. Alright, check the operation of my, make sure it operates correctly. It does. Don't necessarily would have to do that. Just make sure it's operating right. All right, I'm coming down my trailer.